Hello, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am so impressed with you for listening to sermons in your spare time. If you like what you see here, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, like what you see, comment, share, and so forth. So today I want to talk about Hagar. And let me just start by reading a little snippet from Genesis chapter 21. Hagar, in case you have forgotten, was the maid for Sarah, Abraham's wife. Verse 8 in chapter 21 begins like this. The child grew, meaning Isaac. Isaac grew and was weaned, and on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham had a great feast. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking. And she said to Abraham, "Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance of my son, Isaac." The matter greatly distressed Abraham because it concerned his son. But early the next morning, Abraham took some food and the skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulders and then sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. Then she went off and sat down about a bow shot away, for she thought, "I cannot watch my child die." And as she sat there, she began to sob. God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. This is one of our sacred stories. So in my last sermon that I posted on here, we talked about the importance of male lineage in the patriarchal culture. And male lineage is exactly what is at stake in the Abraham, Isaac, and Ishmael story. For the longest time, Abraham and his wife Sarah aren't able to have children. And having children was so important that Sarah came up with this idea to give her servant Hagar to Abraham so that he could have a son that way, through Hagar, which was a pretty weird thing to do, in my opinion. But it worked, at least in the literal sense, and Hagar gave birth to Ishmael, and Abraham finally had a son. However, it wasn't exactly a happily ever after kind of ending, because having a son that way turns out to cause a few complications, as I'm sure you can imagine. Sarah resented Hagar for giving her husband a son, which she wasn't able to do. Hagar resented Sarah for making her sleep with Abraham and get pregnant against her will. Needless to say, things were a little dicey between them. Then they got even more complicated when Sarah finally, after years and years, got pregnant and gave birth to Isaac. Because in Hebrew culture, the firstborn son was the favored one, the important son. And even though Isaac was Sarah's first son, he was Abraham's second. In Sarah's mind, the only way to solve this mess was to get rid of Hagar and Ishmael, and so she did. She sent them away into the wilderness, and while they were there, they almost died. Now, after reading passages like the one I just read to you, or the one I read last time about women being expected to marry their rapists, you might start to think, if the point of the Bible is to point us to God, where on earth is God in this book? Which would be a totally fair question. And it's one I want to at least begin to answer. Where is God in the Bible? In this particular story, God shows up at the end, just as Hagar begins to sob because they have run out of water. The text says, God heard the boy crying. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying." And suddenly, Hagar sees a well of water where she hadn't seen one before. God, it seems to me, shows up rather miraculously as water in the middle of the desert for a mama and her boy who are dying of thirst. That sounds like the kind of God I want and need, the kind of God who shows up when I am most desperate. In the Bible, we most often find God showing up where people are hurting. It's not just Hagar. It's over and over and over again. Wherever people hurt, God is there. Now, when I was doing my research for this sermon, I came across something really interesting. I discovered this letter that Sarah, Abraham's wife, had written to Hagar years after she kicked Hagar out. Fascinating, right? Now, technically speaking, Sarah probably wasn't literate, and so when I say I discovered a letter, I mean that I wrote a letter, and I'm pretending that it came from Sarah. But it's more fun to pretend, so I'm going to invite you to pretend with me and listen as I read this very ancient and authentic letter from Sarah to Hagar. Dearest Hagar, it's me, Sarah. I know I am probably the last person on earth you want to hear from. Nevertheless, I feel compelled to tell you what has happened. Hopefully by the end of this letter you will see why. This morning Abraham woke up very early and began to pack as if for a day trip. I rose with him and began to fill the skins of water for him. The early morning sun reminded me of the day we sent you away. I had prepared the water for you just as I did for Abraham, only I remained hidden in the tent when he put it on your shoulders and cast you out. I wanted you gone, but I didn't want to be the one to do it, so I sent Abraham to dismiss you. I had very little empathy for the fact that I was asking him to send away his son. In my eyes, Isaac was his son, and he needed no other. I felt no sympathy for the years he'd spent with Ishmael, teaching him how to care for the livestock and manage our affairs. Instead, I felt disdain and the distinct fear that Ishmael might steal some of Abraham's time, or worse, his inheritance, away from Isaac, the one and only rightful heir, in my opinion. As a mother, I felt fiercely protective. As a wife, I felt jealous. It's been years now since all that happened, and to be frank, I scarcely ever think of you. Abraham does, and he thinks especially of Ishmael. He doesn't say so on account of me, but I can tell when the two of you are on his mind. I, however, have refused to remember you. I have banished you from my mind as well as my home. But this morning, when I was reminded of the morning you left, it all came rushing back, and I was flooded with memory as well as a strange sense of foreboding, and I wasn't able to ignore either one. Abraham wouldn't tell me where he was going, but there was the same silent grief and torment in his eyes as on the day he said goodbye to Ishmael. As he packed his things, I could tell he was preparing for a sacrifice, but when I asked him about it, he wouldn't answer. I'd only seen such gravity on his face once before, and so I thought perhaps this sacrifice was to make amends with God for rejecting Ishmael. I quietly tried to help him pack, but he shoved me away and yelled at me to leave him be. I was shocked by his outburst, but when I looked in his face, there were tears in his eyes, not rage. I backed away and gave him space. A little bit later, I was in the tent mending garments when Abraham walked in to tell me he was leaving. I nodded my goodbye. I'm taking Isaac with me, he added. I'll be back by dusk. And at his words, my heart nearly left my chest. I was surprised to learn Isaac was going. Abraham hadn't mentioned it before. But that didn't explain the rising panic. My My chest began to tighten and my breathing grew shallow. It was such an irrational reaction that I stuffed it down and pretended I was fine. Abraham left and I remained in the tent trying to calm my breathing and soften the inexplicable panic. A long time passed and suddenly I realized I hadn't said goodbye to Isaac, and I experienced a piercing urge to chase after them so that I could hug his neck, but it was only a day trip and they were long gone by now. I forced my legs to stay put and reminded myself they would be home by dusk. I was useless the rest of the morning. I couldn't focus on anything. I was irritable with all the servants, and by mid-morning I had a pounding headache. I hadn't experienced this kind of physical ache for my son since the day I began to wean him. And for some strange reason, I then started to think about Ishmael when he was Isaac's age now. How his voice was beginning to deepen, and it would make us all smile, even me. To tell you the truth, in that moment, I missed him. I missed Ishmael, which is not something I ever thought I would say. It surprised me, and so I swung my thoughts back to Isaac. He'll be back by dusk, I repeated to myself yet again. Only when I said it, a pain shot through my head. I tried to close my eyes and sleep, but suddenly I gasped and shot straight up in bed, remembering what Abraham had said. I'll be back by dusk, not we'll be back. And in that instant, I just knew. I don't know how I knew, because who would ever suspect such a thing? But I knew now that Abraham was planning to sacrifice our only son. I remembered now that Abraham had packed all the equipment for a sacrifice, but I hadn't seen him choose an animal. I remembered the torment in his eyes. I remembered his unusual secrecy about it all, and the way he snapped at me and tried to prevent me from helping him, as if he wanted me to have no part in it. Without another thought, I tore out of the tent and began to run. I had to catch them. I had to. I had to stop Abraham. It occurred to me I didn't even know which way they went. Frantic, I spun around in circles trying to decide. My heart was pounding in my chest. They had been gone for hours by now. I knew I couldn't catch up to them even if I did know which way they went. But I refused to let myself acknowledge it. He wasn't dead. He couldn't be dead. Oh my God, I had to try and stop this madness. So I just picked a direction and sprinted. I hollered as I ran, "Abraham! Isaac! Abraham!" I screamed. Alarmed, the servants rushed after me and tried to stop me, but I pushed them away and kept running. Eventually, they gave up and let me run. "Abraham!" I yelled in rage. "Isaac!" I sobbed. There was no answer. I screamed and ran for as long as I could until my lungs demanded that I rest, and I fell to my knees in the desert sand and wept. The sand clung to my sweaty skin like ashes, and my hair stuck to my face as I swayed on my knees and moaned. I beat my breasts in mourning. I tore my clothes. I cried out to God, and I shook my fists at the heavens. Why, God, why? My voice grew hoarse from yelling, and I was exhausted and parched from running in the hot sun, but I didn't care. What did water matter if I didn't have my son? If he should die, my life would end. And without warning, in the middle of my grief, I thought of Ishmael again. I specifically remembered the sound of his laugh, hearty and full, and against all odds I smiled at the memory. I wiped the tears and snot from my face. I paused from my own agony, and I remembered Ishmael. And I remembered you, Hagar. I wondered what it was like for you, wandering in the wilderness without direction after we kicked you out. For perhaps the first time, I wondered how you felt. I'm ashamed to say there are times I hoped you and Ishmael died out there in the wilderness. But as I sat there in grief over Isaac, I hoped with all my heart that you lived. and that Ishmael lived. I hope you never had to see him suffer. No mother should lose their child to an untimely death, and I cannot believe I put you through that risk. Hagar, I know my words probably mean very little to you now, but I am so sorry. No righteous person would ever threaten the life of a child. What I did to you was evil, and I deeply regret it. I've heard rumors over the years that you made it safely out of the wilderness, and even that in your hour of dire need, God provided. Isn't that just like God? To take care of things when humans act like idiots and screw things up, like I did. I began to wish God would be merciful to me and my son as God was with you and yours. But I knew I did not deserve it, not after all I have done. Dusk was beginning to arrive, so I picked myself up off my knees and began to trudge home. It was a calm night with a gentle breeze, and it all felt so surreal. When I arrived at camp, Abraham was already back. When I entered the tent, he looked as old and as tired as I had ever seen him. He looked at me in my disheveled appearance and torn clothing, and I could tell he knew that I knew. "Isaac is asleep in the other tent," he whispered. "What?" I said, nearly breathless. Abraham closed his eyes, scrunched up his face tight, and tears began to flow down his wrinkled cheeks. Tears to match his instantly sprung up in my own eyes. "He's home. He's safe," Abraham managed to say between the sobs. "How?" Abraham shook his head almost in disbelief. "There was a ram." He let out a giant breath and cried even harder. "Thank God, there was a ram." I clutched my heart as the tears and snot flowed freely down my face. But why?" I demanded. Why did you take him there? Who are you?" Abraham grimaced. "I don't know, Sarah. I don't know. I thought God was testing my faith. I thought it was a test." "Don't you think we've been tested enough?" I screamed, utterly incredulous. "I know," said Abraham. I know. Maybe it wasn't a test. Maybe I went crazy. After all these years of guilt, I thought perhaps this was my punishment for sending away Ishmael. After that, who am I to be worthy of a son?" He was crying so hard he could barely get the words out. "I don't know how to explain it, Sarah. It all feels like a big, terrible mistake. All I know is that an angel of the Lord stopped me, and God provided a ram, and our son is alive." I shook my head in disdain. "I will never forgive you for this, Abraham," I said, and I walked out in disgust. What kind of man nearly kills his own son on purpose? And then I crept into Isaac's tent to kiss him goodnight and found I couldn't bear to leave him alone, so I curled up next to his sleeping body and held him close. A long while later, I heard Abraham enter the tent to check on us, and when he joined me beside Isaac, for some reason I didn't try to stop him. I just let it be. And eventually the two of them were snoring in rhythm, keeping me awake, but I didn't care. Snoring meant breathing, and breathing meant living. I couldn't have been more grateful to hear Isaac snore. Hagar, I don't expect you will ever forgive me for what I did, and I'm not asking you to. I hope God will forgive me, and I will work on forgiving myself, and that will have to be enough. I am only writing because what I did to you was terrible, and I can see that now. I had gone running into the wilderness to confront Abraham for his stupidity and misguidedness. I had no idea I would end up confronting myself. I went out into the wilderness to save Isaac. I could have never predicted that God would save me. Truth be told, I didn't even know I needed saving. I was part of God's chosen family, after all. It hadn't occurred to me that I might be wrong, dead wrong, about you. It hadn't occurred to me that you were family too, even though our sons shared so much in common. It hadn't occurred to me that you and I had anything in common. It hadn't, frankly, occurred to me that you were human too. So on this day, the day of my awakening, I write to you, my sister, to make amends. May the Lord bless you and keep you, my dear Hagar, and may the Lord bless and keep your son. May God's face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance and grant you peace. With sincere love and deepest regret, Sarah. I don't know if almost losing Isaac actually made Sarah reflect on the way she had so callously disregarded Hagar and Ishmael. But I like to imagine that maybe it did. That maybe when we pay close attention to our own suffering, it connects us to the suffering of others and helps us to understand their pain in new ways. And it seems to me that in the Abraham and Isaac story, God shows up as a ram, much the same way God showed up for Hagar and Ishmael in a well of water. Which makes me wonder if it is true that in the Bible, God shows up the most in places where people are suffering and hurting. Do you suppose that might also be true in real life today? Like, wherever people are suffering in our world today, there is God. God shows up with the immigrant and the refugee. God shows up with the outcast. God shows up with you when you are hurting, when you are being shamed, when you are suffering loss, when you are depressed or suicidal, when you are anxious and confused, when you feel like the outcast or the person who is being left out. That is when God is paying especially close attention to you, my friend. In your worst moments, God is close by. Just like how Ishmael's crying prompted God to help, your tears and your pain and your anxiety are like prayers that call God to you. There's this other story about Hagar in the Bible that I didn't read. It's from Genesis chapter 16, and it's when Hagar first gets pregnant with Ishmael. And Sarah is so mean to her that Hagar decides to run away. She eventually comes back, but while she is gone, she encounters God in the wilderness. And during this encounter, she is the first person in the Bible to name God. She, a woman, a foreign woman, a slave, is the first person to give God a name. And do you know what name she gives God? The one who sees me. She is astounded by this encounter with God, and she says, I have seen the one who sees me. How does God show up in the Bible? As the God who sees you. Where whatever you are going through right now, God sees. God knows. God hears. God is with you. And so may you know that you are not alone. You are seen. May you allow your suffering to connect you to the suffering of others so that you will see what God sees, their humanity, their loneliness, their need to be loved that is so much like your need to be loved. May we go from this place trusting in the God who sees. Light, love, liberation for all.